At this year's Duo, we were asked if it would be possible to make videos of some of the presentations. This is because some of the routines that we often explain can get rather complicated, especially when you're jumping back and forth between settings in Twist and ES, and within ES, just between different panels and different settings. The first of these that we'll review is one of the presentations we did that shows how to use either the HTML5 or the Java viewer within one session in ES. And by a session, I mean logging in under a specific user profile and then being able to use one or the other of those viewers, typically based on which milestone we're at. Now we know that a user profile is normally tied to one particular viewer, but the request here would be for a user to jump out of the HTML5 viewer and then be able to use the Java viewer so that the closed loop option can be utilized. As we know, this is currently not available with the HTML5 viewer. And there really is only one setting that has to be turned on for you to be able to do this, but there are many different areas that have to be enabled or disabled so all these pieces can come together to achieve the final effect that we want to do. So let's jump out of Keynote and get into ES. And what we're going to cover here is settings for user profiles, settings for user profiles that are defined as a profile mask, how to attach those to a milestone so that the switching can be achieved within a workflow. And we'll also go over some color settings and viewing condition settings as well that should be taken into account when setting something up like this. First, we're going to go through a project and actually see the desired outcome, and then we'll backtrack and try to do a deep dive into how all the interconnected parts and settings are tied together to achieve it. So if we'll look at one of these files, and we notice in the right-hand column that there are 4 different approval steps in this workflow. And make note of the user profile we're currently logged in as. This is a profile called New Profile. So if we launch and view this file, we can see pretty quickly that this user profile is associated or has the HTML5 viewer enabled. So we just approved it at that first step, and notice it jumps down to our next step. And if I view it again, we're in the HTML5 viewer, and now we want to push it forward. Now what we see next, though, is we come to a milestone that's labeled as color critical. And if we look a little closer at this file and look at the properties, we notice that at this milestone in the process, there's actually a viewing condition associated with this user, with the admin user. So what we know in terms of how ES behaves is if you have a viewing condition assigned to this user, ES will not allow us to approve that file unless we're in a color-controlled environment. Furthermore, since the HTML5 viewer doesn't currently support the entire mechanics of the closed loop approval settings, we want this file to launch in the Java viewer. Now we've already seen that this user profile is associated with the HTML5 viewer. So when I try to launch and view this, we would think it's just going to bring the HTML5 viewer up, but instead you see that we do indeed have the Java viewer working for us. And we have all the color settings that we would associate with it, and notice that it preloaded the viewing condition that was associated with this user. So we now see that indeed we can switch viewers midstream without having to log out and in as a different user, well, maybe the same user, but with a different user profile. We're going to approve that file, It's going to move to the last milestone in this workflow. And notice we once again have the HTML5 viewer brought to bear. So this is what we want, and the question now is, how did we do it? So let's review the settings that allowed us to get here. The user profile we're working under is this one, new profile. And really we're just going to concern ourselves with one setting, and that is the dialog engine setting for viewer, and indeed it's set for use HTML5. So the question then is, when we got to this particular milestone, this color critical one, why did it use the Java viewer? And the reason is that milestone has a profile mask attached to it. And the profile mask, this one that I just selected here, if we look at the dialog engine setting, notice it has this option called Allow Viewer Switching. So the meaning of that, as you've seen, is pretty obvious. If we were running the HTML5 viewer and this profile mask has him disabled, the reasoning is it's going to let us switch and use the Java viewer instead. Going further, although these two profiles, this guy and this guy, have been created and defined, we now have to make sure we understand how those interact so we get the effect that we wanted in the workflow. This is the workflow, or the document workflow, that we were working with. And we see the different milestones that we were playing with. This was the first one, the second, and no, that's the first. That's the second. And this is the one that forces the Java viewer on us. If we look at the ES workflow, there's really nothing in here that would indicate to us that we're going to get this change in behavior. So merely viewing the workflow is not going to tell the tale for us. We only know that's where it's going to happen, but we still don't know why it happened. So to find that out, we have to look at our milestones, specifically this one called color critical. And when we view him, again, there doesn't seem to be anything out of the ordinary. He's just a milestone, and he's got a color and an icon assigned to it, and that's it. The key is under the User Profile tab. And you'll notice that there's two settings here. There's a user profile and a profile mask. So what does this mean? What this tells us is that if a user is logged in with this profile, and within the document workflow, if we come to this milestone, then ES will apply or overlay this profile mask. And profile masks are essentially, basically the term I just used, they are an overlay. It's a way to take the settings initially assigned by the user profile that we're using and then change those to normally either restrict what the user can see when at this milestone, or in this case to bring into play an alternative setting. And again, the logic is a user logged in as this profile, when he hits this milestone, assign this profile mask. Backing up a bit, there is one thing that we should point out. You may have noticed when we looked at our current user profile earlier, under the viewer setting, we don't see that allow user switching option. And it's important to remember that that option will appear only if you're working with a profile mask. So if I enable that setting, you'll notice now that that option appears for us. But again, that's only when working with profile masks. There's one final thing I want to cover. It isn't necessarily to do with the Java versus HTML5 viewer, but it does have to do with working with viewing conditions and forcing a user to work in a color-controlled environment. Notice at this milestone, this color critical milestone, that there's actually two approvers assigned. There's the administrator, who we're logged in here, and I also have myself assigned as a approver. Now we saw earlier that if the administrator tries to approve this, ES is going to tell him, no, you cannot do it. Sitting over here in Chrome though, I'm logged in as this other approver. Now watch what happens if he tries to approve it without actually viewing the file. He's going to say OK, and notice he was able to approve it and push it forward. So it's not necessarily the fact that we have it set to switch to the Java viewer that prevents a user from pushing it forward. More importantly, it's that the specific user who was logged in here did not have a viewing condition assigned to them. Without a viewing condition, ES assumes that you have not told this user that he must work in that color-controlled environment. And just to show how that can change the behavior, we're still logged in as that same user. Let's tell ES that that user needs to work with a certain viewing condition, and we'll use the same one. So now watch what happens if this user tries to approve the file without actually opening and viewing it. We'll try to do the same thing we just did a few seconds ago, but notice now it will not let us approve it forward without actually opening and viewing. And as you can guess, if I try to launch this now, it will launch the Java viewer, but I'll point out that I'm in Chrome right now, and since Chrome doesn't support the Java plugin, I would meet with bitter failure if we tried that. So I think that wraps up all of the bits and pieces of how this routine is put together. We'll hopefully have another one out soon for a couple of the other routines, and hope this was helpful.